Hello, everybody, and welcome to a panel that I know is going to be, crazy good. I cannot believe the amazing panelists that we have put together for this topic, a topic which is, really incredibly important. It feels like it's becoming more important every day, actually, and that, of course, is this infodemic that we are faced with right now. So what we're going to do in this panel, we are really going to keep this very, very straightforward. We are going to talk about the nature of the infodemic, all the misinformation that is out there, ways that we can counter it, ways that we can push back. What does the evidence actually say? Does debunking really work? How can we counter the misinformation? And the other thing I hope I want to get to, because this is such an amazing group, so I'm excited about talking with them too, is I want to get a sense of what they think is missing in the misinformation discourse. What have we forgotten about? What do we emphasize too much? What really needs to be done? How can we get creative? How can we see our way out of this chaotic information environment? So look, I am not going to introduce any of these individuals. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So how this is going to work today, you guys, is I'm going to call on each one of you, and then I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Tell us why you're here and what you think. Give us like a couple minutes of what you think is really key. And then we're going to have a conversation among ourselves, and let's be provocative, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So let's get started, you guys. Let's dive in. Let's go. Buckle up, world. Sam, I'm going to start with you. So tell us who you are. And what you think is really crucial to this topic. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Tim, and hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Samantha Yamin. My pronouns are she and her, and I go by the nickname online of Science Sam. I'm trained as a molecular biologist and neuroscientist. I got my PhD in those fields at the University of Toronto, studying stem cell biology, which is actually how I first met Tim. But now I'm a full-time freelance science communicator, and a lot of my work involves communicating the science behind the headlines through social media, largely on Instagram, and also consulting with other scientific institutions and organizations on how they can better communicate their science through social media. So it's been a very interesting year to be a science communicator, for sure. What's been most interesting to me is if 1 year ago you asked me questions about COVID, my answers today may be a little bit different. But if 1 year ago you asked me about how to mitigate an infodemic, I probably would say the same things. And in fact, a year ago yesterday, May 5th, 2020, I wrote an opinion piece for Nature about how scientists can use social media to spread science. And the first tip that I gave is really the crux of what I want to discuss today, and that is to amplify first. When we think about an infodemic, we often think about the misinformation piece, which is very important and we must focus on, agreed. But we forget that an infodemic is also an avalanche of information. It is just an overwhelming amount of information, both accurate and false. And what I've really seen true is that social media, which is really my expertise here, is both a tool and a solution for the infodemic, for that avalanche. And in fact, what needs to happen more and is so dire and not being done is to be more strategic and thoughtful with our use of social media. I think most people know how to post, but they don't really know, they're not being mindful about how they're interacting with things in their newsfeed. And that's actually perpetuating the infodemic and the avalanche of information. And it's causing us to fragment messaging, which just makes it all worse. I know that I'm overwhelmed trying to keep up with everyone saying everything, right? Which is great. There's no gatekeeping. Everyone can have a platform and a voice. That's awesome, because science historically doesn't give everyone, someone like me even, a platform and a voice. So it's great that we can anyone can be the speaker on social media, but we must be strategic so things aren't fragmented. The core solution, and then I'll move on to the other panelists because I'm sure they have a lot to say. The core solution, in my opinion, is that strategy, and is thinking about amplifying rather than noise creating. We've seen lots of funding to create new initiatives, and now we have a million voices and experts to go to. Instead, I really want us to see centralized messages in fewer places. And we can then break through echo chambers. People talk about echo chambers, they exist, but they are not impenetrable. And the way that you break through an echo chamber is by being strategic with your social media, having things that are very shareable, the bite, the snack, and the meal, each of those layers of information to different levels of depth, but each of them being very shareable. And so now everything I do on social media is, okay, this is the story. How can I tell it in a way that's easy to share? Someone can download this TikTok video, screenshot this Instagram story, which Jess is amazing at, or just pass on, reshare this or retweet this. It must be shareable, so we have fewer sources and we break through more echo chambers. And the evidence for this, I'll just say, this is what the Disinformation Dozen is amazing at. They are so good at being the source of awful information and sharing it in very easy to pass on ways. And that's the only thing they should get credit for, and the only thing that I think anyone can learn from them.
Thanks a lot, Sam. That's excellent. I had echo chamber as one of the things I wanted to, so check on my list. I do want to come back to that because I think breaking through the echo chamber is a real challenge, and I think one in this polarized discourse that's going to get ever more challenging. Okay, I'm going to go to I'm going to Emily next. Emily, please introduce yourself. You've just done a ridiculous amount of research in this space. I pride myself. I think I publish a lot. Holy cow, Emily, slow down. You're making us look bad. Okay, over to you, Emily.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Emily Braga. I'm an associate professor in the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. And so I research how people identify misinformation on social media, how we can best correct it and respond to it, and increasingly strategies to preempt it, things that we can do to make us resilient to misinformation rather than being always playing catch up behind the curve. Samantha started us out so well because she talked about so many of the strategies that are really important. What I want to stress about the infodemic is that it is such a complicated, complex, confusing world. And it's not just about misinformation. It is about not knowing what is true, what is false. And sometimes there's so much information, but it's actually not the information you want, which adds to that complexity of sorting out what we need to know, when we need to know it, and making sure that that is the highest quality information. And so what I think this really suggests is misinformation, infodemics are a huge problem, and they require a huge solution. So we need experts like Samantha, like other people on this panel, who are producing that high quality content that is shareable, because that's such an important first step. If you're an ordinary social media user, though, you have a place. And the first place is by amplifying that high quality information, responding to misinformation when you see it. We know that these types of corrections can work not just in the moment, but ideally creating a space where responding to misinformation is not seen as dangerous or combative or cruel, but caring and thoughtful and empathetic and supportive. It's our environment. We need to make it as good an information environment as possible. And so thinking through the different ways in which experts can create that content to make publics able to support them in promoting and sharing and getting that information to spaces that those experts might not be reaching on their own. And then also thinking about ways to put pressure on social media platforms to make sure they're doing their due diligence, they're supporting these efforts, making sure the high quality information is what we see first, and that the low quality information, the misinformation, is just not given the space to breathe and to reach people.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Emily. And you raised something that I want to sort of prime everyone to think about. And this is the question of tone. Is there a place for snark out there? Is it, Sam knows this. On my list of things you're supposed to do, I always say, be nice, be empathetic, be humble. But does tone really matter? And I know the evidence, right, Emily? It's a little more mixed than a lot of people realize. Hey, but I still think be nice. Okay, Jessica, I'm going to you next. I think that you are an individual, you're a scientist, you're kind of like Sam, right? You're also a science communicator. Love to hear your thoughts. And I'm after, when it gets question time. I'm starting with you, and I'm starting with your Goop article. Okay, so over to you, Jessica.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Molotti Rivera. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and I got my degree in emerging infectious diseases from Georgetown many moons ago, while also working on a project that essentially used open source media to track and identify emerging biological threats in animals and humans. So essentially preparing for the scenario that we're in right now. It was fascinating work, and it also trained me to be a science communicator, to know the science of science communication, knowing which things to focus on, which things to ignore, which things are going to become problematic trends or conspiracies. And most recently, I've been doing that kind of work, at least translating the epidemiological data with the COVID tracking project and trying to help essentially, do some pre-bunking and debunking at the same time, right? Training people to have increased science and data literacy so that those bad takes are prevented, and making sure that everybody from an average consumer to large newsrooms were able to use that data and make correct conclusions from that data and not make gigantic leaps, which we've seen time and time again throughout the pandemic. I feel very strongly that the work of science communication in the context of infodemics is it requires two things. It requires cultural competence and emotional intelligence. And I think a lot of people just have jumped on this, I'm going to be a science communicator and debunk stuff, and then just kind of lose people because it becomes vitriol in the other direction. It becomes shaming and scoffing at and mocking and ridiculing. And it assumes a lot of things about the audience. It assumes that every single person's a bad actor, which is not the case. We know that there are people who, like Sam mentioned, the disinformation dozen, they're a loud minority of people. And unfortunately, their volume is, louder than ours sometimes. And the actual numerical volume of their content goes viral much more than our content does. But that doesn't mean we should throw everybody in our language, our lexicon in one bucket and speak to them as if they're a monolithic group, which is just, very unfair. I think we're seeing that especially now with vaccine hesitancy, which often gets confused with anti-vaccine sentiment. And I think that's a really unfortunate mistake, because we miss opportunities to really know the difference between misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy, and things like fear and confusion. So, I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel. I feel like we're all very aligned and passionate about this topic, and I'm grateful to be here.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Again, you brought up the tone question, which I'd love to dig into a little bit more. So over to Roxanne, and I was lucky I heard Roxanne speak just now. You're fantastic. And Roxanne, you're a good person to end on, because you're a science writer, so you're trying to bring together a fantastic science writer, bring together all of these issues, including dealing with risk and how you represent risk to the general public. How do you make it for a piece that has traction with both the scientific community? And this is something I think that you do really well. It has traction with both the scientific community, but also the general public. So over to you.
Thank you. And just listening to what everyone said has been inspiring. Jessica, what you were saying about pre-bunking is kind of what I wake up every day hoping to do. And what was mentioned about tone is so important, because I think that accessibility of journalism that is trying to get things right and not spread misinformation is key, so that you keep the reader engaged. I mean, I was thinking as everyone was talking, the 3,000 words I wrote for The Atlantic on blood clot risks related to vaccines is never—
Great article, by the way.
Thank you. Thanks. It's never going to be as funny as a TikTok video about the same topic. So I know that I'm competing with a lot of the things that I'm sure we'll discuss. And I think that, as from a journalist point of view, the things that I try to do very earnestly is to try to find out the mechanism of action related to a health matter, and to make that mechanism of action, so what's going on inside the cell, so engaging to the reader that it does pre-bunk, and that it does kind of make somebody understand it, so that when they get some misinformation, they're not as susceptible to getting led astray. And the two other things I would just mention is that we science journalists and the misinformation age are kind of also grappling with preprints. And although they're not disinformation per se, they can be dubious in their nature. And we've kind of got to be super careful about how to deal with that. And how do we see that in the ecosystem of what everyone's been talking about so far? And lastly, I think that the thing I I try so hard to do very earnestly again is to get things right the first time, because when we science journalists and health journalists are putting this stuff out, it's all about trust and accountability and building that relationship with readers. So there's no journalist out there that's going to get things right every single time. But if we strive to talk to the independent sources and to kind of get the context in from the get-go, you don't kind of weave back and forth with the information so that the public is left confused and then gravitating towards some of the simple, the videos or the things that simplify things that seem more appealing in that kind of scenario. I think since everyone heard me, or some people might have heard me speak at length before, those are just a few things I would throw out to start.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very, very much. So I'm going to be selfish. I'm in control, so I'm going to start with a question that I'm fascinated in, and that I struggle with, and Jessica, it was prompted by your Goop interview, which I thought was great, by the way. So if you think I'm going to be trolling you here, you're wrong. I thought you did a fantastic job. But it raises a really interesting question that I bet every person here has struggled with. Perhaps Roxanne, well, maybe you too, Roxanne. Do you go to these places where misinformation resides, or are you, so Goop, do you go on the Joe Rogan show? Not that he's going to invite me on. Do you go on Fox News? Are you just legitimizing it? Are you fueling false balance, or are you going to where the misinformation resides and speaking to a community that needs to hear from you? And so I think it's really interesting, and we can open up that question a little bit further. In both the United States and in Canada, conservatives are the most hesitant. They are the most likely to spread misinformation if you believe the research. So do you go to those forums, or are you just legitimizing them? So Jessica, I'll start with you, because I've actually struggled with this, and I've had conversations with other science communicators who struggle with this. And by the way, I think you made the right choice, so I am not trolling you, but I'm curious what the gang thinks. So Jessica, I'll start with you.
I think you bring up a great point. I remember getting the email request for the interview and kind of giggling, because I thought, surely they have not followed me long enough to know what I'm going to say here. But it was actually the person who reached out had a similar background. She was somebody who understood public health, who studied science, and was kind of in the company to kind of help elevate the science kind of legitimacy of some of the things they were saying. So I said, okay, I'll talk to you. And I was very frank. I said, look, I am going to be very critical of the kinds of topics that have been spoken about on this website, and they did not edit out any of kind of my criticism or even just my strong language about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines at the time, because that's what they were really inquiring about. Now, that said, it wasn't even a couple months later when they posted an extremely problematic article about remedies for COVID-19. And I wrote back to that editor. I said, hey, we had a really frank conversation about where I stand on a lot of these things. I find this to be very much in contradiction to what we talked about. And I got an apology email. I said, we're working on fixing this. We recognize the feedback that we got was extremely negative, et cetera. I have not seen a well enough kind of takedown or apology of that. But the fact that I got somebody's ear within Goop to kind of listen, to understand that there are people who are not just out to just say it's all trash, but you can do so much better because of their sphere of influence, was encouraging to me. Now, am I going to be a contributing writer for Goop? Absolutely not. But if somebody's going to ask me how to answer questions on vaccine hesitancy or vaccine safety and efficacy, I'm going to make sure that they understand the science.
Yeah, a great answer. And we know that, I've seen a couple articles on the Goop. Yeah, I go daily to find out what Gwyneth is saying, promoting vaccines, right? So is that a little win? Is that, this is a website that has been anti-vax or, vaguely anti-vax. So it is interesting. And a quick question before Sam, I'm going to come to you next. Was the article the one about Gwyneth and long COVID that you complained about? I mean, that really problematic, so there is this balance. Are you legitimizing the whole website, and then she can, leverage that? So it's a tough balance. Over to you, Sam.
I think there are two key considerations for something like that. I agree. I thought that article was fantastic. I was so happy to see it, Jess, and I think you were the perfect person, honestly, to do that kind of thing. The two key considerations for me would be, one, who has the editorial control? I would be really hesitant to go do a video interview, let's say, with someone where they're editing the video, because I know that they could twist my words and something like that. So I would be really mindful about that, which I think that you were. The other thing to consider is Goop is a place that people turn to often because they felt excluded, or they felt that their healthcare practitioner didn't pay attention to this thing that they're dealing with. And you go to Goop and you get this kind care, and people reach out and ask for you. There's an episode of one of my favorite podcasts, Still Processing, called We Got Gooped. And they interview, I'm forgetting the name of the fantastic journalist who did this whole deep investigative piece on Gwyneth Paltrow. I don't know if you know Tim. Anyways, it's a great podcast episode, and it talks about why people go to Goop. And in the case of Goop, it's because they feel, I think, often in many cases excluded, or they're not getting care. And so I think going to places like that are very important, because people are looking to know better. People do have good intentions and they're seeking help. And it's just unfortunate they're often misled. So I think for those two reasons, Goop was the right choice. Jess, I think you made the right choice.
Well, and asking for
Sam,
that.
what about you? Go ahead, Jessica.
I was just going to say, like, they offered a final look before publishing, which I appreciated. And I, had the chance to read every single written response that because they, transcribed the interview, and I was allowed to provide, post interview edits and final green light for publication, which I really appreciate.
Oh, that is great. And I want to come back to a little bit later, because I want to dive into the tone thing. Because I think it's relevant to this, but there is that concern of legitimizing the website, right? So that's the one thing on the other side. One of these I hesitate, and I don't think this happened in this case, which is good news. Is the potential for false balance. If you have editorial control a little bit, you can avoid that. But before I move on, Emily, Roxanne, do you have anything you want to add to this?
I was just going to add, when we think about this from an individual perspective, so I am not an epidemiologist, a virologist. Like, my knowledge about the science of COVID is, the level of the general population. When you're thinking about responding from that perspective, I think that the calculus has to be a little bit different. So when you're seeing someone share, like a friend or a family member, who I'm sure we all have, sharing misinformation on social media, we need to think about, like, is responding going to, again, promote something people wouldn't otherwise see and give it, oxygen in a place where we wouldn't, and thinking about who's likely to see it, how likely it is to cause harm, how rigorous we can defend it, and the size of the community seeing the interaction are all things I think you should keep in mind as to deciding, should I be responding on platform and providing corrections so that everyone who sees this bad information knows the good, or whether it's something I might want to take offline and give, Aunt Jenny a call and be like, well, actually, here's what you might be misunderstanding, or I can see how this would be confusing, but you should know the CDC says X, Y, or Z. So the calculus is similar, but a little bit more nuanced when you're not somebody who has a national platform, but you still have that ability to make your community's information environment better.
Okay, excellent. And if we have time, I want to come back to this, but let's go to the topic of tone. And Roxanne, I'm going to go to you first, and then Emily, I'm curious if you can. I want to hear what your impressions are about the existing evidence around tone. Roxanne, I heard your last presentation. I thought you made some really great points about tone and about being engaging. But it can be challenging. So I'll put it this way. I'll start with the more provocative point. Is there a place for snark, for anger, for those biting comments, or do you just think we have too much of that right now? And then speak to what you think about tone.
I mean, snark in the context of like a science article, like that I would write, or another science.
No, in fighting misinformation and countering misinformation.
Sure. I mean, why not? I think that I have no informed, data-driven response to that question. I guess I try really hard to respond with kindness and empathy to, all of the Twitter remarks that are thrown at me sometimes. And then there aren't that many, which I don't know if I should be grateful, but occasionally there'll be somebody that says something from out of left field, and occasionally I will just respond with a kissy face emoji, because that's my way of bringing snark to the equation, to say that I don't really have time. I mean, there is a British, or not British, there's an author who wrote a book about beauty, and has been saying some things that I don't agree with in this pandemic about some information. And, you know, I should probably, I'm gonna dish all here. You guys are getting it all. So she said something about, you know, like, she asked me to fact check something. It was a Twitter conversation. She's like, well, you know, like, show me the evidence. And I said to her, I'm sorry, but I don't have time to be your personal PubMed assistant. So, you know, referring to this website of research articles. So was that snarky? Yeah. Would I do that in every single situation? No, particularly not with somebody who you know, so this person was unique in that they had a giant platform, and I kind of had tried before to speak more reasonably with them and they hadn't listened. So I think when all else fails and you need a human outlet, sure, snark, but you have to be conscious that you're not digging yourself into a hole and that you're not being unkind. Like, I probably will regret that one day. Who knows?
You know, it's interesting. I almost always regret this when I am, you know, you get angry and you do it, and I almost always regret it. My rule is if they're, you know, famous and they're selling something, bring on the snark. And the other thing is that some individuals, some voices can get away with snark and it works. Like my friend Jen Gunter, for some reason Jen can, you know, if I said what Jen said, I would not come across well. But Emily, I want to go to you because there actually is some interesting research on tone. You know, there was a piece, I'm embarrassed because probably one of you was the co-author on this study, and if so, I apologize. But there's an interesting study that was published, I think, in November, basically arguing tone didn't matter. It was all about the content and the memorability of the correction. So when you're talking about correcting misinformation, do you think tone matters, Emily? Sorry, putting it on you.
So yes, I co-authored that piece with Letitia Bodie.
So,
our conclusion was that when you look at the effects on the community seeing the interaction, the correction was equally effective, whether it was kind of factual, whether it was uncivil, or whether it was very sympathetic and affirmative. That's not to say, though, that sympathy and empathy isn't going to be more effective when you're thinking about the person you're doing the correcting of. Right. So when you correct on social media, there's two audiences. There's the person sharing the misinformation, and they're often the hardest one to reach because they're the one who believed it enough to share it and publicly did so. So you want to be very cognizant of shame being something that's really likely to turn them off. There's the secondary audience, everyone seeing that, who are less invested potentially, and maybe therefore less affected by tone. So I would say on the benefits, the empathetic approach is one that's probably going to appeal to a lot more people, and especially the person you're correcting. And secondly, like, we want to make norms where social media correction is okay, where it's valued, where it's part of being a good citizen. If it's snarky and rude, I don't know if we'll get those. I guess in defense of snark or incivility, like, you also want to get attention. And I don't know if I understand why you're wrong, or I understand why you're confused, but here's the truth is going to get as many clicks as if you are in fact good at snark, which I am not, if you are able to do that effectively. But I know Samantha's also written about this, so she probably has more to say.
Sam?
I have one, yeah, it's really interesting, that research. I would say, I think a lot about the power balance. If it's kind of a random account and I feel like I'm representing scientists and I have PhD in my name and a blue check, and I don't think that means much, but to some people it does. And so I don't want to feel like I'm abusing my position of authority or misrepresenting. But I think there's I do think there's a place for snark, as Tim said, when it's someone with a lot of power, with who's selling, and you're not really talking to them, you're talking about them. But if I can just say, I think Jess and Roxanne, like, I consume a lot of your writing and your content. And I think you both strike a really nice balance that I think about often, in that you're very assertive and brief. Like, you'll just say it in like 4 words, or Jess sometimes will just post a boomerang being like, no, with whatever misinformation based questions one was asking. And it's just the brevity and the assertiveness, I think, is a really good thing to use more often than snark. But snark has a time and place, especially if there's some humor, which can help de-escalate. But I don't opt for it online, but in person, I'm very snark. I think online I'm like very nice, but in person I'm constantly reading a room. So,
That's not true. That's not true. Sam, I think that those are really good rules. What you outlined. That's kind of how I try to look. Most people are they want to get the right answer. They're just if it's Gwyneth Paltrow talking about long COVID cures, bring on the snark, right? So selling product, Tom Brady, I can snark your supplements. Let's segue, because I think this is related. Let's segue to the issue of false balance, and I really do think this is important. And some of the people watching, by the way, bring on those questions, you guys. There are already some great questions in Slido. A lot of people might think this is an esoteric topic. It's not. I think it's really, really important. So the case I want to use is natural herd immunity, the Barrington Declaration. And again, I'm being selfish. I warned you at the beginning, I'm selfish. We're actually studying this right now. We're doing an analysis of how that was represented in the popular press and in the conventional news media. So I'm not even talking about social media, Emily. I'm talking about in the respected press. And there was a whole bunch of false balance, right? So how do we address that? So, maybe Roxanne, I'm going to put you on the spot. And then maybe over to you, Jessica. How do you talk about a fringy idea that the public might be interested in a way, especially if it comes from, people who came from Cambridge and Stanford and Oxford, in a way that doesn't create that false balance? And research tells us, we all know this, that false balance does real harm, right? It does real harm to perceptions and also behavior. So how do you do it, Roxanne? What are your strategies? And you do it so well.
Sorry, I'm muted. I think that one of the things I have to confess I'm guilty of is as a freelancer, I have the luxury to say, I actually don't want to pay attention to this Great Barrington Declaration. Like I would rather, look at, read my books about genetics and kind of get lost in the science. But I do think that if we ignore things and they take on a life of their own, they do kind of become monsters sometimes. So I think I'm going to continue to go back to what Jessica said about pre-bunking and what you've said about tone. And I think when you pair those things together, and when you're very conscious as a journalist of the structure of your article, so that you're kind of making, if you are assigned to write about something that people are saying that aren't qualified to say, that you have a first line in the story that tells it like it is. And so I think that, a first sentence to say that these people are not, why their findings don't make sense. It's work, but it's work that's necessary. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Yeah, it does. And I think the point about making the scientific conclusion, the big takeaway, natural herd immunity is not the way to do this, but we're having this debate is really key. What do you think, Jessica? Because you do wrestle with, trying to represent, science. Thoughts?
Lots of thoughts on this, because as we've seen in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of clout chasers who are basically armchair epidemiologists, or even kind of trespassing into a space that they really don't have any subject matter expertise. And as a result, you're seeing people kind of affiliate themselves or associate themselves with these things that seem very fancy, calling themselves frontline workers or signing a declaration, which has this kind of like false weightiness to it. And it causes people to, reallocate their trust. And I think that part of the process of debunking and pre-bunking is to increase people's literacy in this, to show them, to direct their gaze to the actual subject matter experts, to people who have been in this space for a long time, which is why I was actually delighted that the counter to the Great Barrington Declaration was the John Snow memo. John Snow, if people know, was the grandfather of modern day epidemiology, and people who were actual subject matter experts in infectious diseases and understanding how herd immunity is exclusive to mass vaccination and have many years of publication in this, signed that memo as a direct counter to that, because it's essentially, and I don't mean this as a way to gatekeep, because I do think that we should be offering people platforms to speak and not be, policing that. But there are a lot of bad actors who have become very popular during the pandemic, who are directing people in the wrong way and are telling them that, because they have these names and titles and landing pages. I mean, if you just spent 5 minutes on the Great Barrington Declaration, you would see that some of the signatories were bots and like actual joke names, and it was quite silly.
Homeopaths, lots of homeopaths loved it.
Exactly. I mean, it was quite silly, and I think that even in debunking it, I was very careful to say, like, this looks legitimate, but it's not. Let me help you see how it's not. Let me tell you, like, these are the, you know, the kind of influencers or the scientists and the experts that you should be following, because this really is smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, I agree. Wonderfully said, Jessica. But Emily, do you think that, tell us what the evidence says about the harm of false balance? Because, I've had arguments with journalists and they go, well, we can't censor people. We've got to hear these different perspectives. But there is a way, and I think, Jessica, you did touch on this a little bit, but there is a way to represent it in a way that's not going to do harm. Am I right?
Yes, and you're exactly right that if you present two sides as being equal when they are not, one of the strongest predictors of attitudes and behaviors is perceptions of scientific consensus. And while scientists can do more to continuously bolster our credibility to speak to people in their language, scientists by and large still maintain pretty high credibility. So if it looks like scientists don't know what the answer is, people aren't going to be able to figure that out on their own. So making it very clear where scientific consensus is. And like Jessica was saying, the strategy of false expertise is one that has been used in disinformation campaigns for decades. This is not new. This is something we see over and over and over again, and highlighting the ways that can be used to mislead so that people, when they see something like this, are skeptical rather than credulous would be really helpful.
Yeah, and there are those studies that have shown that false balance with respect to in the early days with respect to the autism vaccine, really interesting. But that's also kind of a good news story, because I wonder if everyone agrees with me. You can nod your heads that the media got better at that. Right at the beginning, they were very much about false balance with respect to the autism. Jenny McCarthy on Larry King talking, debating experts from the CDC, and we remember Jenny McCarthy. I think they got a little better with the false balance, and so I do think we can bring along pop culture to understand false balance. So I think there is a little bit of good news there. Does everyone agree? Yeah, I mean, I like that skepticism. Okay, so the next thing, other topic, and we got to start opening this up to the audience real quick here. But the other topic that I think we all agree on is shareability, right? This idea that if we're going to do this, if we're going to counter misinformation, it's got to look good. We got to do it in the places where misinformation resides, which is social media, largely, not entirely, but it's got to be shareable. So Sam, I'm going to go to you, because one of the criticisms that I've received is, hey, Tim, your debunk looks like the misinformation that is being pushed out. You're using the same fonts and it looks just like, I can't take you seriously. What do you think? Shareability is so important. Do you hurt your credibility if you emphasize that too much?
I think shareability is key. I think it's like the number one, not the number one, I'm being dramatic, but I think it's one of the big ways that we're failing. Truly, there's so much good information hidden behind websites that just, you can't share a link easily on Instagram. The link click-through rates are really low, and that's where people are consuming misinformation. So shareability is so important. The first thing that a lot of people need to think about at the time that they're gathering the story is, how will this be shared in an easy way on the different platforms? It needs to be part of the early planning of a story. I think what you're saying is the look and feel of it. Should we use the same tactics and production tricks that, not even the other side, because again, that'd be false balance, but that the disinformation people use? I think to some extent, they use the tricks that work on the platform. Quick cuts work. Wearing a lab coat works with some people. Like there are certain things that just work and are inherent in the platforms. And I think instead of modeling after the disinformation sharers, we should model after the people making TikTok memes, the fashion and beauty bloggers. I model so much of my Instagram content after them because they are good at getting content out and read. So I think we should learn from content creators who are very successful and use some of their, I know that you're a big advocate, Tim, for art, having an artistic take on sharing the science. Will get more people seeing it, and that's key to getting out of the echo chamber. So I think having a fancy look and feel or a more jazzy look and feel. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's actually really important, but it's usually an afterthought. No, as a consultant who's worked with many people on social media stuff, it's always the last step and it needs to be part of the first.
And I think that there's a lot of science communication training that needs to go on about this. I'm sure you've experienced this, Sam, and others, where you work with a scientist and we're going to do a short YouTube clip. Yeah, it's like 6 hours, it's 6 minutes long. No, no one's watching a 6-minute YouTube clip. Nobody, right? Unless you're The Rock, maybe. I don't know. You're doing bicep.
Can I say, sorry, can I please say one thing to that? I just want to say, I think a lot of people are tempted to do like a long webinar. And I think webinars with a very specific focus or those kinds of live sessions are really great. But think if it would make more sense to just do short videos that are Q&A. Because people are not looking for generic information. They're looking for specific things. So can you just do like make a 1 minute or 30-second YouTube that's like question and here's the answer and that's it? Because that's what people are actually searching and looking for. That's how you optimize like with SEO. Jess, I know.
Unless it's this webinar, by the way, this webinar.
No, but this is a specific, very narrow scope, right?
Yeah.
Like, but people will be like vaccine webinar, and it's like no one cares.
Every moment is golden. Emily, could you talk a little bit about, again, I don't want to put you on the spot here. Yeah, maybe I do. The evidence about shareability. I mean, it's true. Sam's just not pontificating here, right? The evidence is there to back this up. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, people don't click on links. So you need to be thinking about what people are going to be seeing as they're scrolling, as they're, on Facebook or Instagram for cute dog pictures or whatever it is. They're not usually there for either good information or bad. And so what they see first off is what they're going to take away. They're not going to go read your journal article most of the time. And so that's one of the things that finding people who do it well, and I think I want to say all three of my co-presenters do this very well, and sharing it yourself is way better than trying to come up with it from scratch if that isn't your thing.
Okay, before we get to the questions that are coming in on Slido, which are awesome, and keep them coming, I got to go with a really tough one. Okay, you guys. So put on your thinking caps. This is a tough one. It has to do with AstraZeneca. It has to do with Johnson & Johnson. It has to do with how we represent risk with context in a way that is transparent, that's honest, but still isn't going to play to all those cognitive biases that makes representation of risk, availability bias and all of those other things. So this is really, I think, an incredible challenge. And those of you in the United States may not know that this has become a huge issue in Canada. Am I right, Sam? Over even the last 3, 4, 5 days. So Roxanne, I'm going to you first because you've had a little chance to take a breath. How do we do this? I think this is an incredible science communication challenge. And the reason I think it's so important to what we're talking about today is the misinformation people, they leverage misrepresentations of risk like no one's business, right? So how do we represent this stuff in a way that's constructive?
And the we you're asking is reporters or scientists, or who is the we, I guess, in your question? That would help me.
Okay.
That's something I've been wondering about.
I'm saying all the above. All the above, yeah. Okay, I'm talking truly all the above. Policymakers, scientists, journalists. But let's start with your universe. Let's start with your universe. You don't have to cover it all.
Okay, well, I will just say that it's been a wild week in Canada. As people here might know, in terms of and was it this week? I feel like it was this week where NACI, which is like it
was this week.
Yeah, it was this week, right? So I'm learning these things because I just moved here in December 2019 after not living in Canada for more than a couple decades. But you've got the branch of this advisory body saying some things about how if you can wait for an mRNA vaccine, you should, and then Health Canada says just take the first shot you can. So we are living in a world where the ecosystem of regulators is not in agreement or sounding the same thing. So that's something that we've got to acknowledge. And one thing I thought that was really interesting was that Quebec's health lead said recently that the situation is different now than it was a few weeks ago. So yes, if I think that we've got to include that temporal aspect in this conversation. But I guess what you were asking about, if I've got it right, is how do we converse about these things so that they're not hijacked by misinformation agents? Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, and that we're representing risk in a fair way. We're putting it in context, because I think that's in many respects, that's what this is about. And Sam, I'm going to go to you next. So because I think you and I, Sam, might differ on this, but what do you think?
I think I might actually differ on this from other people on the panel as well. When I wrote that long article for The Atlantic, if you look at it closely, it doesn't really delve into the numbers so closely, because at that time, people were kind of saying, oh, it's only 1 in, X 100,000. And I thought to myself, those numbers are going to change. And so when we can dig ourselves into a hole if we don't use those comparisons, but we can also dig ourselves into a hole if we do. And it always goes back to tone. And it always goes back to saying, if you're badgering people to get the AstraZeneca when they don't want to, that's not the right tone to use. I think our job as journalists is just to say, here's where it's at. And it's not easy.
It isn't easy. And Sam, I don't know if we disagree. I think that was a wrong sort of tease into our conversation. I think I was more upset about NACI's response maybe than you. I found it really frustrating, incredibly frustrating, given that it will. In fact, there was a study that came out recently. It is going to increase hesitancy. But it's weird because I'm a hypocrite, because I'm also all about transparency and honesty and full informed consent. I've written a lot on consent issues, but that representation I think was just not ideal. Over to you, Sam. What do you think?
I really want to hear what Jess has to say on this actually too, but the one thing I'll say is I think transparency is really key, but I think that a core component of transparency is also accessibility. So if you read the 120-page report from NACI, the message was a little bit different from the line that they kept repeating about which vaccine is preferable. And so I think that's where they kind of screwed up on the transparency part in terms of their communication being unclear, but their science and the rigor of it was great, but the transparency hasn't been clear. And it contributes to the infodemic when you have many sources that aren't aligned. And then everyone has their interpretations. And then there's just this whole waterfall of different takes. And it's very overwhelming and confusing. A lot of people who are a lot less thoughtful about talking about the clotting risks were really quick to just jump to like, well, what's the risk with birth control and this and getting struck by lightning? And in some ways that can be helpful, but personally, I found it a little bit dismissive and kind of lacking the empathy. Like, it is a scary thing. Vaccines are different than other medications because there's something you take preventatively. And so people think about the risk differently. It's different if I have a strong pain and I'm going to take a painkiller. That's a very easy decision. But when I feel fine, that's why people think about vaccine risk differently. I don't think that, I'm not saying that we should, but that's how it is for the person. And I found a lot of, because we didn't have a unified response, especially in Canada, it made room for a lot of hot takes and quick takes that I found to be quite dismissive and contributed to way too much noise. And it's been a devastating time to be a Canadian and a science communicator because it's just been so hard. But Jess, I feel like you will have the answer. I don't know why. I feel that from you.
So Jess, a lot of pressure on you, Jess. So get ready. But before you start, I also think what was really missing is so much of that calculation with the AstraZeneca, and I think we saw this Johnson & Johnson too, was the individual risk, right? And the benefit to the public was almost not ever mentioned. And that's I take a vaccine, not because of me, I take it for my community and my neighbor. That's actually why I do it. And that wasn't in any of the discussion, which I think was also really problematic. Okay, Jess, bring us home. Give us the answer.
I don't have the answer, but I think, Sam, you're absolutely right in the sense that, I think humans as a species are just really bad at assessing risk. We're bad at kind of calculating how to make decisions about everything from health and wellness to vaccines. And Tim, to your point, in general, vaccines have been that opportunity to be very altruistic and get vaccinated for others. But it took a while for the data to justify that for COVID-19 vaccines, because in the very beginning, if you remember, it was very much about your individual protection, because we didn't have the data to say, this will prevent you from transmitting the disease. This will prevent you from getting long COVID. This will prevent you from shedding the actual virus to others if you become infected. And because of that, it looked like a lot of moving goalposts, a lot of moving kind of, conclusions. And that all of that was eroding trust over time. So the fact that people are not seeing consensus from the very beginning because they are, this is the first time the scientific process has been so on display for every single person to look at, from preprints to, interim data that's read out from a press release, which is totally normal because of, publicly traded companies needing to do that. It has turned into, oh my gosh, nobody knows what they're talking about, so we have to make these decisions on our own. And risk is somehow the consequence of that. People's understanding of individual risk, people's understanding of how to make an informed choice. And I think, Sam and I have talked about this a lot, just kind of how the Canadian government has kind of been transparent or not about how to even pace the vaccines because of what's available to them. I get DMs constantly from frustrated Canadians asking, how can we make an informed decision when it seems like even your government and your regulatory system is saying something that is so counter to what's available to us here? How do you have a 42-day grace period? And how does the UK have 12-week data? And we're just kind of sitting here waiting for 16 weeks between doses. You immediately put people in purgatory when you do something like that, where they feel like I can't make sense of this anymore. And I think that one of the ways that we can rebuild trust is to kind of remind people that the scientific process, unfortunately, does involve a lot of change, right? Or fortunately, really, it's because we're learning and we're constantly evolving and constantly getting more data to inform this. I think that's why there needs to be almost like code switching on the platform that you're using, because it is so easy on Instagram for a meme to spread about something like this. And it would require all hands on deck from everybody who does SciComm on Instagram to then come up together literally in a DM to be like, how can we fix this? And then come up with a meme to counter it, because the trust is gone, risk assessment is completely trash, and we're just doing damage control for a week.
Okay, that was pretty awesome. You did bring it home. You landed that one. It's funny, Sam, when you said everyone, it's hard for the public when all the decision makers disagree. Everyone nodded. It would have been an awesome meme. That would have been perfect. It was perfect. Okay, so let's go to some of these questions, and they're all great, and they overlap with some of the things we're talking about. And one of the big questions, no surprise, is about echo chambers. It's about echo chambers in the world that we live in. And I do think this is such an incredibly important question. Emily, I'm going to go to you first. I get this question probably every single time I present. Is there any reality to the idea that we can break through these echo chambers? Are all these things we're talking about really going to have an impact on those communities, especially when we look at how increasingly polarized all public discourse is becoming?
Absolutely. Echo chambers are not absolute. And we see this especially on social media, where we all have that uncle or aunt who's sharing misinformation. That demonstrates just how diverse our social media landscapes often are. Yes, there are places that are very much an echo chamber. You can get on a Facebook page where everyone is going to agree with you on that topic. But the rest of your social media probably doesn't look like that. And I also think that it's important to leverage those social relationships as much as you can, and have those difficult conversations across lines of disagreement, maybe offline, maybe someplace else. But echo chambers are certainly a component of social media, but they're not determinative.
Before I let you escape this question, but what about the algorithms? A lot of people are asking about that. This is our search engines create our universe, right? They really do, right? That first page. Talk about that a little bit.
They totally do, but they do in conjunction with our decisions and the decisions of our friends, right? Algorithms depend on the input we give them. And so if we're actually strategic about how we use social media, if we're willing to interact with communication we might not agree with, talk across lines of difference, the algorithms are seeing your engagement and seeing your attention and saying they need more of this content. So something you could do is strategically engage with something that you disagree with but respect, so that you get that kind of content and see what other people are doing. So we have control, not complete control, but the algorithms don't control us. Absolutely, we have feedback as well, and we can use that strategically to make, again, social media a better place.
You know, I subscribe to newspapers from across the political spectrum. I really do, and I try to look at all. I used to look at Fox News, but it started to kill me. So, but I really do, and I think it's a great suggestion, Emily. Roxanne, when you write something, are you thinking about the echo chambers?
Well, I am, but I'm not thinking about the echo chambers that a lot of people are thinking about as we're discussing this. Because one thing I'm burning on my mind as we were discussing this is even the conversation about blood clots and vaccines itself is an echo chamber. Because what I think about when I'm writing is, why is nobody talking right now about other things? Like, you know, the example of Canada is, I haven't heard a lot of discussion about, you know, our local, our vaccine production capacity and our attraction of biotech. So it's like, I'm thinking about, yes, I guess I'm thinking about, you know, when I'm writing a long story on blood clots, 3,000 words, digging into, you know, here are the different theories and the science. I am thinking, okay, I hope this penetrates and maybe gets into one of the echo chambers where this misinformation is spreading. But I'm also thinking about what's my next story that is not related to this conversation, because even it's like almost a meta thing where we're kind of talking about the disinformation about one topic, but we kind of get lost in figuring out this complex question that is seemingly impossible. But at the same time, there's other topics that are getting neglected.
Sam, how about you? I mean, you are amazing at reaching different audiences. Do you specifically think about strategies to break the echo chambers when you're making your content?
Definitely. I think we have to remember echo chambers exist, but again, they are penetrable. And I don't even know how many billion or many $1,000,000 industry of advertising is all about how to do strategic digital marketing to reach a target audience. So the best practices already exist, and we just have to adapt them for science, which is a little hard. But one of the core things is with your hashtag strategy. Again, something people don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but on Instagram, you have 30 hashtags that you can use. Use all of them if you're doing a post in the feed. You can even use them in your
exhausting though,
stories.
Sam, coming up with all of them.
I'll send, if anyone here is doing science content and you don't know which hashtags to use, send me a message. I have all these little categories saved on my phone in the notes app. I'll send them to you. There's no hiding of information here. Seriously. But the hashtag strategy is how you penetrate, because that's how content is indexed in the algorithms. They also look at other things. I don't really know, it's kind of a black box, but they'll look at the content of the photo, the color, the feel, or their faces. And so being really mindful, again, who am I trying to reach? What type of, just think of yourself on social media. What are you gravitating towards? What's the tone? What's the language? What are the words that are used? Emojis? What types of pictures? What's the editing? And then now put yourself in the shoes of your target audience. Do the same thing. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. And I think that's what's really key, is just, again, you're trying to tell your story as Roxanne. I love what you said, like you're talking to the person interested in your story, but what's the person not interested in your story doing? And how can you bring them in? And so it's penetrable if we're thoughtful and really mindful, but if it's an afterthought, it'll be too late.
I put cats in my feed. That'll do the trick. So,
yes, there's
real
data
quick
on
question
that.
for you, Jessica. The goop. I hate to come back to the goop thing. I don't want that to define my conversation with you, but that's another reason to do those kinds of things, don't you think? You know, to go to those unusual locations with the science.
Absolutely. It's kind of like what I meant when I was referring to code switching. It's like knowing who is listening, knowing who is watching and scrolling and potentially taking screenshots. I knew that the folks who also follow Goop, even ones who kind of have that discerning mind to know most of this is garbage, but I still love the hair, like the skincare, like recommendations or whatever it is, or the diet, like the recipes, they're going to be able to be, know that when I'm doing this, it is not to validate, it's to provide, context, nuance, the granular stuff that's usually missing when you go to a source like that for information.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So the other question that we've received, a couple on this point, and holy cow, is this the right audience for it? Is how do you engage those different audiences? So it kind of relates to what we just talked about, but I think the question is more about those communities, right? So there are particular communities that may be particularly vulnerable to misinformation. There's some research, Emily, I think you might have even worked in this space. You do so much, you publish so much, you've worked on every topic I'm talking about. But, for example, youth. How do we engage the youth? Some researchers suggest they're particularly vulnerable, maybe because of exposure to on social media. The older population, particular communities. So Emily, maybe start with you. Do you any thoughts on because I always say it's the general public is your audience. That's one of I always hammer away at that, but that in some ways isn't really true. You do want to think about the different communities.
Yeah, definitely. A targeted message. There's a reason there's such a growth in micro-targeting. Samantha's point about advertisers have been doing this. People whose job it is to persuade have been doing this a really long time, using those lessons as we think about who are the audiences that need to consume this message. And it does mean a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. A message that is very effective for young people might not be effective for old people. Anti-vaxxers versus vaccine hesitant, totally different groups. You need different strategies to reach them. And there's a lot of reasons for vaccine hesitancy. So talking about one group's reason might not be at all helpful for a different group. So I think you really need to consider who your audience is, think about what information they are missing or that they are looking for, and then think about the best message and messenger to reach them are all really important steps.
Excellent. So Sam, I'm going to go to you next because I can hear Sam's voice sometimes when I'm thinking, audience, who's your audience? I can hear you. Let's make this practical. Emily's point's super important. Make it practical for me. Operationalize this.
It's SciComm 101, right? Is who is your audience, and don't use the deficit model and just talk at them, engage them. So the easiest way to do this, honestly, is finding the key leaders in whatever community you're trying to reach and have them be a part of the message. You don't need to build a whole platform of reaching youth and build your audience from scratch. Who are youth already listening to? It's probably Charlie DeMello or whatever on TikTok. Right?
I actually know who that is.
Yeah, like, can you engage her or someone like her who already has that, there you go, who already has that connection to that community and can actually speak with her audience. She's already really good at it, and many other people. So I think it's finding, and this is where social media is cool, because it allows communities to organize and talk with one another. It removes the gatekeeping. So find the people, find the communities you're trying to reach and ask them, like, how should I tell this message? Can you be a part of this? Can we co-create instead of just trying to inundate people with what your version of the message is, because it's going to be inauthentic and it's not going to resonate.
Okay, excellent. So believe it or not, we're starting to get near the end of our time together. It's just been so amazing. The time's gone by like this. One question I think is really important that we need to get to is how do you decide what to debunk? There's so much misinformation out there, and I want this advice for me because it's exhausting. How do you decide what to go after? And I think it's a really important question because as we know, research has told us even absurd stuff, 5G technology can take on a life of its own. You might say, I'm not going to waste my energy on that, and then it becomes a thing, right? It becomes a thing. So how do you decide what to debunk? Where do you put your priority? Maybe I'll start with you, Jessica.
Yeah, I've often said that there is a science to science communication, right? It's discerning what, if you choose to debunk something, you could inadvertently breathe more oxygen into that fire, and you don't want to do that. Now, as somebody who's been in like tracking vaccine and misinformation for quite a while, you know that there are some topics that are quite sticky. Anything related to fertility, anything related to reproductive health is going to stick, and it's going to snowball into something that is very, very uncontrollable. And in many ways, we can kind of see through it because it's a lot of copy paste from previous anti-vaccine handbooks. You just see a lot of the same messages about Gardasil that are being claimed about COVID-19 very conveniently. However, because those things have an underlying tone of how do we strike fear? How do we get to the emotional reaction of people? You know that that's where you need to spend your attention. Is there something that, I mean, yes, some of these are very laughable, but if it's connected, and sure enough, the 5G narrative was connected to this whole vaccine conspiracy right now about shedding and becoming radioactive, and then therefore causing things like bleeding, menopause, miscarriage, etc. It's very easy to just throw that out as just trash science. But if you think about it, it is intended to cause panic, fear among a population of people who are very, very vulnerable to that, because they're already having to deal with so much information about the fragility of pregnancy and the difficulties of infertility, that when you turn your eyes and focus on what is actually intended to cause fear and panic, there's common denominators that are very easy to identify.
All right, excellent points. Fear, the usual tropes. If those things start coming up, maybe you should hop on that debunking train. So, Roxanne, I'm going to go to you, because you have, I'm guessing, you may have a little bit of a different calculus, because you're doing often, not always, a little bit longer pieces, right?
Yeah.
So, what kind of decision do you make when you're going to debunk something?
I mean, some of my stories have been shorter, and the ones that have been shorter have been the things that have responded to the conversation. Because I think Jessica was almost like in my brain this last few minutes, because what she said about weighing up whether giving something some airtime or some words on a page is going to feed it when you really don't want to feed that monster is something that journalists and their editors talk about all the time. And I don't know if we always get it right, but we really try. And I've been thinking a lot about, especially in this conversation, what's the role of journalists in debunking misinformation? It's not like when I was 7 years old and I told my parents, I want to be a journalist. I was imagining a world where I was responding to the ecosystem that we have right now. But it's a reality of the times we're in that we actually have to address these things. And I just everything Jessica said is true for journalists. It's just true. It's just true.
The idea, I'm sure everyone here has seen that research by Ecker's team about, it's safe to repeat misinformation. So kind of debunking the backfire effect. And there's been a couple of studies have suggested that it's safe to repeat the misinformation when you're debunking it, as long as that's the memorable part of what you're doing, right? So I think it's important to have that caveat at the end. But I'm going to you, Emily, next, because I totally agree with everything that's been said by Roxanne and Jessica. But it isn't always so easy, right? Because these, 28% of Americans believe the Bill Gates conspiracy theory. There is some evidence that it makes sense to debunk stuff quickly, right when it comes out with a legitimate voice, even if it's kind of absurd. So it isn't always easy to choose. Is that fair to say?
That's totally fair. If it were easy, we would have solved this already. It's not.
We're solving it today.
You have to think about what everyone is saying. Like, how likely is this to spread? How likely is this to reach audiences who are going to find it credible, that taps into some pre-existing knowledge or thought about the world that resonates with them? And so thinking about all of those components, and also whether you're the best messenger to debunk. Like, sometimes I won't debunk something because I'm not the right person. So that's also part of the equation, is who is the right person? And if you're not them, is there a way you could get them involved in that conversation?
Could I add something to that? In the the topic of when you're debunking, you also should have a place for people to land. Like, you don't want to just say this is not true. You want to take them to the truth, right? You also want to show them how to find that truth. And I think a lot of this has happened when we see people misuse data visualization, right? I'm reading this fantastic book called How Charts Lie by Alberto Cairo about how there's this authority that comes when you see line graphs and bar graphs and pie charts, and people think somebody smart did that because it involves data viz and a spreadsheet. But you can tell people this was manipulated. This is not the kind of chart that you want to see. Take them to the place where the truth is, or show them how there's flaws when you don't see a legend that's properly marked, and kind of help them elevate their own individual science and data literacy. I think we tried to do that a lot at the COVID Tracking Project to make sure that people were able to discern the difference between lines that had no correlation, and people would jump to these correlation causation fallacies because they didn't know how to read a chart. So it was kind of, debunking, but also taking them to truth has to be part of your goal.
Oh my gosh, taking them to truth. Hashtag taking them to truth. I love that. Look, we're almost out of time. The number one thing right now people want to talk about. So I'm going to give everyone one sentence on this. I have two questions I want to get to. One sentence for all of them. Okay. The first one, and I'll say what they both are, so you guys can start thinking. How does social media solve the social media problem? Like, this is about regulating the platforms. And number two, in this era of uncertain science, where we're deciding about how we move forward, how do you deal with that uncertainty? So I'm going to go with you, Roxanne, first. Sorry.
Oh boy. Okay, so
social media platforms.
Social media platforms.
What do we do?
I want to backtrack on what I said about snark. Too much snark is bad. So empathy. Social media can solve this social media issue, I think, with more empathy towards why people are seeking misinformation. And do you want the second one now, or do you want the second one after?
I'll go around and around. Sam, over to you. Social media.
I think some of the stuff that the social media giants are doing now is really, really good. They're establishing relationships with their top creators. They verified credible sources. And now, on Facebook and Instagram, they have this wonderful COVID resource center that's actually really nice to go through. I wish it had happened sooner, but I think the relationship building and prioritization of science in their algorithms, I think, is the main thing the social media giants can do.
Emily.
I really want to agree with everything that was just said. To put it shortly, they can't do it alone, and we need this to be a solution that involves the platforms, the public, science communicators, politicians, experts. All of us need to be working together on this problem.
Jessica.
I think the call and response nature of social media is changing things for people, because it's not just talking at people and sharing content. It's being responsive and listening, which is part of how you help people go from fear to information that can help them make good choices. I do Q&As on Instagram all the time, and I think the fact that people see me responding to DMs and answering questions has validated this as a source for people to talk to somebody who might know the answer, and it's less kind of multiple layers of distance.
Okay, so I'm gonna rejig this last question, because I'm gonna make it about what science is. What science is. This idea of uncertainty, it's always evolving. It's not a list of facts. Jessica, you said this earlier, it's a process. How do we get that across to the public, and how important is that message in battling misinformation? Sam, sorry, I'm making you go first.
Science is a process, and importantly, everyone should be empowered to be a part of that process. And when science doesn't allow that, and we exclude people from the process, that's when we have problems.
Love it. Magical. Roxanne.
I would just say transparency and context are the two things to just go back to time and time again. Just present the facts, but also contextualize them.
Awesome. Emily.
I'll add accessibility. It's part of transparency and context. Helping people be a part of the process and understand the process you're going through is important.
And Jessica, you're getting the last word here. You've got to stick the landing yet again.
Okay. I strongly believe that science is not infallible. It's a multiple person, multiple project conversation that needs to keep going. And if we think about it as something that's finite, it'll be used against us who are trying to help invite people into the process.
Fantastic. And I wish this conversation could keep going. You guys Amazing. Absolutely amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Appreciate all the work that you guys continue to do. We need you guys now more than ever. Really appreciate it. Thank you for all the great questions. Thank you for Genome BC for putting this together. It's been a real privilege to work with these incredible four minds. So thank you very much, everyone. That's it. Bye-bye.